Welcome to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. Gabriel Byrne is an Irish actor, film director, and film producer, a writer, and was named Ireland's first cultural ambassador. Gabriel has appeared in over 35 films, such as Excalibur, Miller's Crossing.
You shouldn't be confronting Jenny Caspar. That's what I've been trying to tell you.
I can still trade body blows with any man in this town, except you, Tom.
And Vernon.
Little Women.
Joe. Such a little name for such a person. You have me.
The Usual Suspects.
Close quarters, 10, maybe 20 men. Anybody goes in there is not coming out alive.
Stigmata, End of Days, and The 33. He starred in the recent HBO series In Treatment. He co-wrote the 1996 film The Last of the High Kings. He's also produced films like In the Name of the Father, which was nominated for 6 Academy Awards. He was also the subject of the documentary Stories from Home. He's also a passionate advocate for accepting the reality of the existential crisis of climate change, and he fights to find effective solutions. And Gabriel Byrne now joins us in the studio. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
So on Reality Asserts Itself, as most of the Real News audience knows, we start with your personal backstory, and then we kind of get into what you think about stuff. Let me, for full disclosure, Gabriel watches the Real News. He's donated a few times, and so we're friendly here, but I'll see if I can't give him a bit of a hard time. You grew up in a working class family in Ireland. And you once said, give me a kid till he's 7 years old, and whether it's the church or some Americanism or fascism, give me a kid till I'm 7, I got him forever. Well, the Catholic Church and Catholicism had you until you were 7. Irish nationalism, which is intertwined with Catholicism in Ireland, had you till you were 7, and they didn't have you forever. So talk a bit about the sort of internalizing of the religion and growing up with such religious thought to the point that, you know, at 11 years old, you go off to a seminary on track to be a priest. Mm-hmm. Talk about that part of your life, and then we'll kind of get into how you break with that.
Well, I wasn't the one who said, give me a child until he's 7 and he's...
So you were quoting someone.
Yes, it was the Jesuits, I think, who came up with that one, and how right they are about that. Because, of course, a child doesn't have the ability to reason. That's why they say that when you get to the age of 7, that is, you have reached the age of reason. Up until that time, it's a form of inculcation, brainwashing, whatever you want to call it. But laid down in the teaching in those years is the notion of heaven and hell, and the idea of consequences for action, but also for thought. You could go to hell for committing an infringement against one's parents or the school or whatever. And I remember once in a class, a teacher trying to relay to us the horrors of hell and the consequence of bad action. He took a kid from the front row and he struck a box of matches, and he held a lighted match under the kid's finger until the kid obviously, you know, grotesquely danced away in pain. And the teacher said, this is what hellfire is like, except that your entire body will be on fire, and it will be for eternity. And he then went on to explain to us what the notion of eternity was. And to us at a very young age, he made us repeat again and again and again the word forever, 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 until the word made no sense. But you knew that there was this place of horror.
Was he a priest?
No, he was a teacher. And And so also on the other side, there was the notion of reward for good behavior, which was heaven. So fear was laid down very early on in the way that you saw the world, and fear was a great way to make you conform. Corporal punishment was endemic to the system, and we were beaten regularly for all kinds of supposed misdeeds. Cruelty and corporal punishment went together. And in a religious institution like the one that I was taught in at the beginning, you had these celibate men and women who had total and utter authority over you. And in many cases, they were extremely unhappy people who were forced into this condition of celibacy and were in charge of children.
How pervasive was sexual abuse in the school?
In the early years, I don't think anybody was aware of it. I mean, there were rumors here and there about people, but we were too young to know what that actually meant. As we got older, of course, the rumors began to be more prolific. But I think the full horror of it didn't come out until we were adults, and we looked back and thought, my God, that was part of what the system was. And although you made a good point there that nationalism and Catholicism were kind of intertwined, and that's true. The way we learned history was interesting. We learned it from an emotional point of view. Our enemy was England. Everything about England was nefarious and evil, and we were very proud of the fact that we resisted the British conquest for 500 years. But at the same time, we had a kind of a victim approach to history, that we were the victims of this appalling country that took it out on us for no reason whatsoever.
And how much of your personal identity was your national identity?
Well, the internalizing of Irish history was an emotional experience. So that there was, in the teaching of history, an emotional element to it. I mean, this was a country where heroes were people who died for the country. That was a thing that was, among many people, aspired to the idea of being a martyr for your country. Those people were venerated. Catholicism was unquestioned, and nationalism to a great extent was unquestioned, and you internalize those things before you had a time to really think about them. So that when I came to 11 years of age, it didn't seem, although it does now, of course, it didn't seem strange to me to decide at 11 years of age that I would want to become a priest. That's what I was surrounded.
In spite of the corporal punishment.
In spite of all that. Yes, in spite of all that. Because also...
But what were you getting at home? What did your parents do? And had bought into all this themselves? Did they challenge any of this in any way?
Well, to say bought into it implies that in some way...
I guess, yeah, it's the wrong word, bought in. Yeah. But they were immersed in the same culture.
Yes, they were because it was cultural. It was social and cultural. I mean, the Irish word for church is teach an phobal, which means the house of the people. And so... it was cultural and social as much as it was religion. The idea of a God and heaven and hell were accepted without question.
But there was a left in Ireland at the time, which was nationalist but not necessarily so religious, wasn't there? Or secular?
I certainly didn't grow up with a sense of there being an oppositional force to it, or there being a left perspective. We used to pray, I remember, for the conversion of Red Russia. The teacher would stand up at the end and say, and now we'll say a prayer for the conversion of Red Russia. And we also had our own kind of colonialism, though we didn't see it as that. I mean, Ireland never invaded anywhere, but we would send out these missionaries to countries and to convert them to Catholicism, because they were godless and had no direction in their lives, so they needed to be saved. And that movement was supported by us at home in the form of putting pennies into a little box where there was a little black boy who would nod his head every time you put in the coin, and that was for the conversion of their souls. So the emotional nationalism that I grew up with, and later came to see that we weren't exclusively the victims of Britain, but we were actually part of the colonial empire, and that other nations also suffered like we did. I can remember my mother telling me that her grandmother saw people starving by the roadside in the Irish famine in 1845, where the population of the country went from 8 million to 4 in the space of 4 years, and which precipitated the huge immigration into America and Australia from Ireland. Had a profound effect, not just on Irish history, but on American history too. And that was a huge psychic wound in the Irish soul, and people remembered it, and they remembered injustice, and they remembered the rising of 1916. I came when I went to England when I was in my 20s to become an actor. I had the real sense for the first time of the fact that I was Irish. I didn't ever question my identity, my Catholicism, really, until I went to England.
Because at 11 years old, you go to a seminary that's in London?
That was in England, yeah.
And any doubts, or you are a full true believer still at 11?
Well, I think when you're...
And let me add, some of the abuse that happened in the school you were affected by, but at 11 you're still headed towards being a priest.
Yeah, because I think that when you are, I don't want to use the word brainwashed, but certainly when you're inculcated with certain notions about the way the world operates, it's not that I sat down and said, I wonder should I. It seemed like a natural extension of the life, the society that I lived in.
But there were a lot of people, not a lot, the vast majority of people that grow up in that culture don't become priests. They may go to church, they may be true believers, but they don't pick the path of that.
True.
Did that get partly inspired from your family or your own internal thing? I want to be a priest.
Yeah, I think it's got complex roots. I became an altar boy first. And that, I suppose, was my first introduction to theatre, because the church and the theatre are not far apart. If you look at the way a church presents its rituals, it's very deliberate. I mean, you have a stage, which is the altar, you have the leading actor, which is the priest, you have stained glass, which produces a certain effect.
It's all theatre.
It's all theatre. Incense, which is a soporific effect.
Even this enormous church with all
it's meant
overpowering architecture.
Absolutely. I was just noticing that when I came into Baltimore yesterday. A lot of churches here, and
this Baltimore was the Catholic city versus New York.
Yes, and the prominence of that architecture in the community. Every village and every town in Ireland has a church, but I became an altar boy, and the congregation, the audience, it was all very similar, and I think there must have been something in me that was attracted to that, even though I'm an extremely shy person and was then crippled with shyness. But yet I had this compulsion to be doing that. I don't know why or how that manifested itself in...
What is your internal conversation with God at this time? I mean, you're praying. It's a real thing in your mind?
Well, it was a personalized God. The idea of it being a force, or an invisible spirit, it wasn't that. It was actually a physical person in a physical place. So that when you thought of God, you thought of an old man with a white beard. In fact, there was a guy who used to live on the street next to us who had a white beard, and his nickname was Holy God. Because that image of God, that personal image of God, and the reality of a place called heaven to a child was deeply reassuring. Because I think that one of the powerful things that religion gives is a sense of reassurance and security, and that the answers to extremely complex questions are in many cases simply laid out. So my relationship to God at that time was a child's relationship, and the religion itself had the magnetism for me of a fairy tale, and there's an element of the fairy tale in the religion anyway, and so the greatest gift that could be bestowed on an Irish Catholic household was to have a priest in the family. And there are families where there are priests and nuns, and several of it, not anymore because vocations have fallen off hugely, but
it would have made your family proud.
Very proud, yeah. And I thought in my child's way that it gave me tremendous reassurance that there was somebody up there, a powerful paternal figure who was taking care of me, and that I could talk to in the form of prayer, and that I could try to live a good life with his help.
What did your father do and mother do?
My father was a labourer. And he worked in Guinness Brewery, the famous Irish brewery. And he was made redundant at 50 years of age. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, somewhat cruelly, but at the same time in a childish way, well, he's so old anyway, he's 50. I mean, what does he care about going to work? But it's only later I reflected on the absolute injustice of what happened to him and people like him, in that their identity as working class men was bound up in the work that they did. And when they got to be 50, they were just thrown on the scrap heap. They got a pension, a small pension, but their worth as human beings plummeted to the point where I'm sure they had appalling days and nights of suffering, because they were no longer the breadwinner. My father used to come in on Friday evening with a little brown envelope, and he would put it behind the mirror, and my mother would take it out and give him back his money for his drink and his cigarettes and his tobacco, whatever. And that was no longer the case, and the roles became reversed, and my mother went out to work.
What did she do?
She was a nurse. So she worked the night shift, and my father took care of us, 6 of us, during the daytime. And I remember my father, that sense of, because associated with unemployment was this notion of shame, that somehow it was your fault. And so I knew he carried, though I couldn't articulate it really at the time, I knew he carried like an invisible hump on his back, this sense of failure and shame, and he tried to do other jobs, but nobody would employ him. And he died at a relatively young age, and I think a great deal of that had to do with
the fact was
he was 66.
About where you are now.
Yeah. And he believed all his life. He went to Mass every single morning.
How much did you share your internal life with either of your parents? Especially when you start having some doubts about the path you were on.
I think the culture of the time, I'm not sure what it was like here, but in Ireland, the idea that parents and children would sit down to discuss an internal life was kind of, I remember there was an American television series that was beamed into us in Ireland, ludicrously opposite to the kind of experience that we had. It was called the Brady Bunch. I don't know if you remember it.
Yeah, sure.
But we used to look at this. We'd all be sitting around in the sitting room on 2 or 3 chairs. I don't want to make a Frank McCourt situation now, but it was, it wasn't luxurious. And we'd be watching this thing called the Brady Bunch, and they had a maid who poured orange juice for them before they went to school, and the father would say, "Okay, kids, let's have a meeting." And I would look at this and I'd say, this thing isn't funny. Why is everybody laughing at this thing? And these kids were saying things like, "Oh yeah, I have a crush on this girl at school," and kids went to mixed schools for a start. They were able to say to their parents, "I had a crush on this," and they were incredibly happy because they had everything. It looked to me like an unattainable ideal, and what was really being shown there was, to a certain extent, the American dream. And the American dream clashed with Dublin working class reality. And you just looked at this thing and you said, my God, there are people who live like that. But that's what America is. Everybody in America lives like that.
You mentioned in school you would pray for the conversions of the Red Russians. You're growing up during Cold War years. And both the American-Russian rivalry, the potential of nuclear war, certainly in this country, relentless propaganda against anything left, anything secular, anything that, even quasi-socialist, never mind communist, and a purge of the left and many state institutions and Hollywood and such. How much is that Cold War ideology part of what you grew up with?
I remember the incident of the Bay of Pigs and the world being brought to the edge of a nuclear war. And suddenly the world started to get really small because we lived in Ireland and that was the world to us. And suddenly there was the possibility of annihilation because these two people were doing what? They were having some kind of a row. And we were all, and I remember watching this they used to put television sets in windows of shops. And we were all gathered around this window of the thing, watching some kind of a discussion or a program about Kennedy and Khrushchev. And I didn't understand it at the time. And I was looking in the window and this guy was saying, well, that guy is Khrushchev. And that guy, Kennedy is the good guy, this guy is the bad guy. And Kennedy's going to stand up to him. But if they attack America, the entire world is going to be blown up and set on fire.
You're about 13 or 14.
Yeah, suddenly the world became a very terrifying place. Kennedy was deified in Ireland because, of course, he had Irish-American roots. And there used to be in Ireland a very common thing, which was a picture of the Pope looking one way and Kennedy looking the other way. And sometimes Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis until she married Onassis. Then she was taken out. But the Pope and Kennedy were the two kind of like earthly gods. So Kennedy could do no wrong. And in fact, he came to Ireland to visit but 6 months before he was assassinated. And they talked about him in the sense of, our boy has come home. You know, the Irish grandfather who left Wexford with nothing and then achieved the American dream, and his grandson became president and all that stuff. So I think after that, I was never as secure about the world. That went really deep.
In the next segment of the interview, we're going to explore Gabriel's next phase as he starts to break with some of the both nationalist and Catholic religion that he grew up with, And I don't know if I'm overstating it, but sort of a coming to a political consciousness that starts to question and challenge many of those assumptions. So please join us for the next segment of our interview with Gabriel Byrne on Reality Asserts Itself.